Hello and welcome. Today, let's make a pineapple cobbler thing. I say thing because I don't really know if this actually qualifies as a cobbler. I made it sort of like a biscuit style cobbler, which is a thing, but I made the biscuits more like sugar cookies. So, cobbler but not cobbler. So, let's get to the ingredients, and then I will show you what I mean by cobbler that's not cobbler, and we'll get that thing made. Real quick before we get to the ingredients, if you guys have anything you'd like to see, feel free to put it in the comments and I will try to see if I can do some of those. Also, if you want to help me out, if you could like and subscribe and maybe turn on the notifications, that would help me out a lot, and it would also make sure you don't miss anything if you're enjoying my content. So let's get to our ingredients, and thank you for watching. Alright, starting off our ingredients, we need one 20-ounce can of pineapple, an 1/8 to 1/4 teaspoon of cayenne pepper, depending on how spicy you like things. You can just do a pinch, or you can do up to, you could go higher than that. A 1/4 teaspoon is pretty good though. 2 teaspoons ground ginger, 2 teaspoons vanilla extract, or vanillin, probably again, good place to use the cheap stuff, so vanillin's great for this. Teaspoon and a half of baking powder, a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. You could just use a pinch. It's not really there to make it salty, it's just a flavor enhancer. 1 cup of flour, 1 cup sugar, and a 1/2 cup of cold butter, which we'll go over in just a moment. Now, before that, depending on what your pineapples, if it's in juice or if it's in syrup, you're either going to need 1 teaspoon of cornstarch or 2 teaspoons. If it's in juice like mine, you'll need 2. If it's in syrup, you'll probably only need 1. If you want to make a larger batch of this, say for a full pie plate or an 8x8 baking pan, just double everything you see here. Alright, now on to that cold butter. So with our butter, what we're going to want to do is, as you see me doing here, take 2 knives and you want to get the amount of butter you're going to be using, which here is about a 1/2 cup, but you could probably increase that by a small amount and get it to where your final topping would be a little bit less crunchy. I actually like this crunchiness on this, so I wanted it that way, so I'm only using a 1/2 cup. The crunchy versus sort of softer is very much going to be preference, so you'll probably want to try both ways just to see how it goes. I actually like the crunchier better with the pineapple because it seems to be it comes across as a little bit sweeter and offsets the cayenne pepper just a little bit, so you're getting all the different flavors we're looking for. Once we get done cutting our butter into small little bits, we're going to want to put it in the freezer and just leave it there while we take care of everything else. The reason for that is if you're like me, I have warm hands, so the butter tends to melt, and the other is that my house is above 70 degrees most of the time. I live in a hot area, so I need to refrigerate or freeze the butter just to make sure that it's not going to essentially melt in my hands and just completely saturate with flour. Because we want some of the pockets that are just butter. That's what's going to give us a little bit of a lighter cookie-style dough, somewhat biscuity, which is also why it's kind of a cobbler, but kind of not. Now, if you wanted a slightly more chewy or not as crispy of a crust, you could probably either add like a 1/2 tablespoon or a tablespoon of oil, or you could add just a little bit more butter. Any fat will do, especially if it's one that's not going to evaporate off. Like butter, some of it's going to evaporate off, so you'd probably have to use like a full tablespoon, whereas oil you might get away with just like 2 teaspoons. Alright, let's get that in the freezer and get to the dry ingredients. Oh yes, one more thing I wanted to add was I've actually tested this recipe with a number of different vegan spreads and margarine. While margarine, it does not work because there's too high of a water content in the margarine, but most vegan spreads will work. Most of the artificial butters, the olive butter, any of those seem to work just fine. So as long as it doesn't have a taste that you're not willing to have in a cookie or a piece of cake, you should be good to use whatever kind of vegan butter you have. Alright, on to our dry ingredients. We're going to start by mixing our flour, our sugar, our baking powder, and our pinch of salt. And we want to take a whisk and we want to mix these very, very well. Because if you don't get it mixed up really well, it'll be very patchy where your baking powder is because we're adding it this way. If you have self-rising flour, you could actually just use that 100% in place of this and just leave out the baking soda. That would work perfectly and probably actually better than this would, simply because the baking soda would be spread more evenly throughout the entire crust. So, once we're finished with our dry ingredients, and our butter has been in the freezer for at least 20 minutes, we can begin on putting them together. Alright, now with our butter partially frozen, as you remember, we put it in our dry ingredients, and what we're going to do is use this spoon here for a moment, and we're going to kind of push everything, we're going to push the butter down into it. We're also going to add our vanilla at this point, so that we'll have the vanilla taste throughout our sort of cookie crust. So the reason we use the spoon is because I want to flatten out all the little pieces of butter in there, and I want them to all get somewhat coated with flour, so again it doesn't get stuck on my hands and the butter stays in the bowl and hopefully gives us some amount of extra air in there. So what you're looking at me doing here is I'm actually taking my outside finger, all my fingers are rotating around the outside of the bowl, pushing things in towards my thumbs, and then my thumbs come in and just kind of press everything out. This is a technique you'll use when you're doing breads, when you're doing a lot of different doughs, and also when you're doing mixes that sometimes you need to do with your hands, but you also want it to be somewhat gentle. The reason you wouldn't use a spoon or anything there is you wouldn't be able to tell how hard you're pushing with the spoon, and you'll have a much better tactile feel from your hands for this. When you're doing something like this, you're also going to notice Layla in the background. But in addition to that, you'll notice that right when you're starting it, it doesn't feel like it's going to come together at all. And you're going to get worried and you're going to think, maybe I don't have enough liquid in here. You have enough liquid. It's similar to the last thing we made where you're going to hit that sandy beach texture, and then it's just going to go almost instantly from there to, oh, it's ready, which is to just a little bit past the sandy beach we went to last time. It should clump together and almost feel like a loose pie dough. Not nearly as dense of a pie dough, but sort of a loose pie dough. It's kind of like that. It's kind of an in-between of those two. It's like not quite pie crust, but also not quite crumble topping. So, even though it does crumble like I just showed you. So, once you have that all incorporated and you can kind of press it out into like almost cookie-like biscuit shapes, then we're ready to go. And like I said, you'll see here, you just basically want to be able to press it together. So, let's get everything combined. Right after we finish putting our crumble topping into the refrigerator for now. Alright, in the cooking pan that we're going to use in the oven, we want to take our can of pineapple, and you're going to want to drain about half the liquid from that. And then we're also going to want to put in our cayenne pepper. Again, if you don't like too spicy, you could just do a pinch. You could do all the way up to a quarter teaspoon and it'll be just fine. And our ginger. And you're going to want to mix all this around just to make sure everything gets incorporated. Once we're done mixing these initially, we're also going to grab our cornstarch. And as I said, I'm using pineapple in juice, so mine's going to be thinner than one if it was in syrup. If it was in syrup, you wouldn't need maybe 1 teaspoon of cornstarch. In my case, I'm going to use 2, so it gets just a little bit thicker. It's not supposed to be as thick as a pie. It's still supposed to be pretty loose looking and sort of liquidy. Part of the reason for that is that it's going to adhere and soak into the bottom of our cookie crust at the top. The other reason we are using cornstarch here is because it's easy to mix. We have a cold liquid and it won't clump, and we can make sure that it gets completely mixed in. So once we get that fully mixed together, we can get our crumble topping and start putting that on. Now we're in the final stretches. All we got to do is just put everything together and it'll go into the oven. So what we want to do is make essentially small patties or biscuits or generally whatever you imagine that would be. The end product you want to be kind of roundish, small, puck-like, probably a little under a half an inch. I made mine about a half an inch thick, and I think that was just a touch too thick. So you want to make them just a little bit thinner than that. You don't want them to cover the whole thing, so you want to kind of leave edges where some of them aren't connected with each other. That's going to help any of the water underneath from the pineapple evaporate and not turn these into complete mush. The bottom half of it is going to be mushy, but in that really good way. The top half is going to come out nice and crinkly. Hello again, Layla. Very nice stretch there. So, as you make each patty, you just set them right next to each other. You'll notice there'll be some edges and center corners that don't have anything, and that's what I'm talking about. That's what we want to rely on for letting some of that vent out so it doesn't kind of just erupt out of the whole thing and Also, so it doesn't fall later without actually becoming solid. Once we get done with all that, it's going to go into the oven at 400 degrees for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to turn it down to about 350. The only thing you'll need to do after this is about halfway through the cooking process, you're going to want to rotate your pan so that both sides will get evenly browned. The total cook time on this after that, the first 10 minutes at 400 is, once you turn it down to 350, you're going to want to wait about 40 to 45 minutes. And you'll be able to tell because the tops will be sort of golden brown and it'll look similar to a sugar cook fresh out of the oven. Now I said 40 or 45 minutes. Now the reason I said that is if you have a dark container similar to this, or say it's a non-stick darker colored container, you're going to want to go with about 40 minutes. And if you're using a base aluminum or a pie tin that's reflective, you'll want to go with about the 45 minutes. And it's just because of the way the material itself absorbs the heat. So after that, you just need to let it cool for about, I would say give it at least a half an hour. It'll still be nice and warm when you get to it, and it'll be perfect, and I really think you should try this. It should look pretty much like this, and once it does, you're done. So today we made a nice pineapple cobbler-ish thing that I haven't quite figured out what to call yet, but that's okay. It tastes great and is a nice change from some of the normal everyday versions. Peach cobbler is great, but why not try something new here and there? It also combines heat and sweet together, as well as a little bit of the sugar cookie-like flavor at the top. And the part that stayed doughy and wet, I didn't mind. Normally I kind of have a problem with that, but in this case I didn't mind because it had just sort of saturated itself with that pineapple flavor, which in my case, I love pineapple. It's one of my favorite fruits. So I hope you enjoyed yourselves and hope you learned something. If you did, why not give it a like and a subscribe and come back for more. Thank you and have a nice meal.